ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Gresham College. My name's Richard Smith, I'm the director of the college, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening to Barnard's Inn. Before I go any further, can I just ask anyone to wave? If you're here for the first time this evening, can you wave at me? A particular welcome to you. We've been waiting for you for 400 years, and we are now complete. So it's lovely to have you join us this evening, particularly for those who are joining us for the first time. Just a very quick overview about what you're going to get this evening. You're going to get a superb presentation and lecture about a topic which will fascinate you with its insight and entertainment, as well as its educational value. That's going to be followed by a period of, where we get a chance to do Q&A. There are two ways of asking your question. You can do the traditional approach of waving, and someone will come to you with a microphone. Do wait for the microphone to come, because the people online won't be able to hear you without a microphone. So you can ask your question by waving. The other way you can do it is, hopefully on the side here, you'll see a QR code. You can scan the QR code with your phone, and that will whiz your message to the tablet which I hold in my hand, and I can ask your question for you. If you're online, there should be a link or a QR code which you can use for exactly the same purpose, and that will come to the same destination. Two other bits of housekeeping. One is, you'll be very pleased to know that we are not planning a fire alarm during the course of this evening's lecture. So if the fire alarm does go, please head towards the exit at the back. For those at home, if your fire alarm goes, best of luck. Do take your laptop with you, of course, as you leave the burning building. And if you could join me and switch phases to stun, that would be super. Right, let's move on to this evening's main event. So our speaker this evening is the Professor of Infectious Disease at the University of Birmingham, and also serves as the Chief Scientist at the UK Health Security Agency, having previously served as the Chief Scientific Advisor at the Food Standards Agency. For us, he is the 39th Professor of Physics at Gresham College, holding a chair first established back in 1597. Our speaker this evening, please join me in welcoming Professor Robin May.
Thank you very much. Welcome to all of you in the hall. Welcome to those joining online. It's a real pleasure to see you here, even though we're going to be talking about something really quite depressing this evening, which is the theory and practice around why we hate. And before we kick off, I'm going to do a quick straw poll. Those of you at home, you're on your own doing this, but those of you in the hall, I'd be interested to know, hands up if you've ever really, really hated somebody. Oh, that's quite a worrying number, actually. I think I might leave now. Those of you online can't see that, but there's quite a hating audience here, which is quite scary. Hopefully not Gresham professors. The rest of you, I'm delighted to hear you've never really hated. I think you're probably being rather too polite. Most of us at some point, I think, have really kind of revved up our strong dislike, if nothing else, of other people. So tonight we're exploring why we hate, what we can do about it, and maybe what in the future we might be able to do to try and kind of mitigate some of the worst excesses of hatred. Before we start, though, I think we need to think a little bit about what we mean by this. So what is hate anyway? And it's actually not as easy to answer that as I think you might think, because as we just sort of alluded to, there's a bit of a continuum between don't really like that, strong dislike, really strong dislike, through to hatred. And many of us kind of blur the boundaries there a little bit. If you look in the dictionary, the definition of hatred is intense or extreme dislike. So that kind of dictionary definition recognises that it's on a continuum. But actually, if you ask psychologists, there is quite a clear distinction around hatred. And that distinction is, it is usually rooted in one of two ways. It's either an acute or a chronic sort of hatred. So acute hatred is usually framed in result of something that has just happened. So here, for example, these people demonstrating after the disaster in Spain. And if you look online at that point, people would say a lot of stuff around hating the Prime Minister. But actually, that's distinct from, I think, what we might call clinically psychological hatred. They don't really hate the Prime Minister. What they hate is the action or lack of action in result of something else. And many of us might have had that experience. We might have been out with friends that I hate the current government. Probably you don't actually hate all the members of the current government individually. What you really mean is something they have done or not done is not what I think they should have done, and I really dislike that. So that's kind of an acute hatred but it's not pathological. Most of us get over it. The government changes, things move on. 25 years later, you don't think to yourself, I still really hate that prime minister, usually. Some people do. In contrast, chronic hatred is the kind of hatred that's really difficult to shake off. This embedded feeling that something or someone is as bad as it can get and you will never change, okay? And that view is usually rooted in two things. It's rooted in your expectation that that thing or that person cannot change. So you hate it because it is irretrievably bad in your eyes. So for example, you hate somebody for doing something, not that they've just done transiently, but that it is a part of their character and they will always do it. I hate this person because they are so mean to people. You don't mean they were mean to that person just now. You mean they are intrinsically mean and they will stay mean for the rest of their lives. And you can't change that, so you hate them. The second point about hatred is it's very often, or not always, but very often embedded in a moral judgment. So you are judging someone who does something you don't like, they can't change it, and that is not just unpleasant, but it is morally repugnant to you. You hate people who believe something or who don't believe something because you believe that it's morally wrong to hold that position, and they're not going to change that position. And that is intrinsically where hatred comes from. And I think it's quite important to think about that definition because in some senses we bandy the phrase hatred around quite a lot. And I think particularly when we start to think about things like hate crimes or interventions in society to reduce hate, we need to think about what we actually really mean by that. What are we really worried about? Are we worried about people in the pub saying, I hate the Prime Minister? Probably not so much, as long as they don't actually act on it. Are we worried about people saying, I hate that group of people and I wish to commit an act of terrorism against them? Absolutely, we should worry about that. And so we need to make that distinction clear. So when I say things like, I hate sprouts, I really do hate sprouts, actually, but I'm not sure that the government needs to intervene to stop me hating sprouts. And I have to confess that although a sprout is probably never going to change, and so it fulfills the first criteria, I don't think it's a moral judgment about sprouts. And so when I say I hate sprouts, what I actually mean is I dislike the taste of sprouts. That's not hatred. On the other hand, if I say I hate Nazi ideology, which I hope many of you in the room would share, I think that's a reasonable judgment. The judgment there is the whole point about Nazi ideology was it was embedded. It was not a transient thing. It was something that people believed in permanently. And it was morally repugnant, at least to me and hopefully to most of you. And so hatred of that kind of thing is something we need to engage with. And conversely, of course, in that particular example, understanding how the hatred that was part of that ideology came about is going to be really important if we're to try and prevent such things happening again. So understanding what we mean by hatred, I think, is incredibly important. So hopefully, if we can all sort of agree on what hatred is, then we can start turning our attention to what it actually is biologically. So what's happening when we hate something? And again, what I mean here is when we really hate something, not when we just dislike sprouts. And it's actually quite difficult to pin this down. So for those of you who've been to other lectures in this series on other emotions, some of those emotions have quite clear biological roots. So there are parts of the brain that do particular things. There are disorders in which the emotion is missing or overly present. Hatred is not quite that simple. There has been a little bit of work looking at brain activity and how it relates to hatred. And I particularly like this piece of work done relatively recently, in which the group looked at individual volunteers viewing pictures of people that they knew, most of whom were people they knew and either liked or were completely neutral about, the person who delivered their milk or whatever. But one picture was someone they had previously identified as really hating. And in an MRI scanner, so in a brain scanner, you can look at which areas of the brain are active in that process. And what you can see in these images here, in yellow, are specific images, specific parts of the brain that light up when these individuals viewed a picture of the person they hated, but not all the other pictures they looked at. So these yellow areas, if you like, are areas that we kind of associate with the feeling of hatred. Just want to be really clear on this. This is not a hate center. You can't cut these yellow bits out and suddenly miraculously solve everyone's feeling of hatred. But they are areas that are deeply involved in that sense of hatred. And the areas of the brain that are involved are incredibly informative. So there are two, broadly speaking, areas of the brain that light up in this particular experiment. The first is an area in the cortex, in the surface of the brain, and that is particularly associated with both aggression and with motor activity, so with movement. And that makes a lot of sense if you think about people's response to hatred, particularly that acute hatred, is very often an aggressive, moving one. They might punch someone in the face, right? So you're activating the area of the brain that is to do with responding immediately to the threat, to the hatred threat that you see. Okay. The other part of the brain that lights up there gets even more interesting. So in the subcortex, so deeper in, you see a couple of areas of the brain that light up, particularly areas like the insula. And that turns out to be very interesting because those areas are previously strongly associated with a feeling of extreme disgust or contempt. So they're the areas that light up when you see something like a pile of vomit. And so you're activating this same feeling of, oh my goodness, there's a dog poo on the street, when you see this person that you hate. The sense of disgust for them as a thing as well as a person, if you like. But what's very interesting is those areas that are associated with contempt and disgust, next to them another area lights up, which is strongly related to romantic love. And that I find quite interesting. So you have these areas that are to do with aggression and violence and stuff, and the same area that lights up when you see, for example, your lifelong romantic partner. And we'll turn to that a little bit later in this lecture, but this idea that actually, as poets have said for hundreds of years, there's not always a big divide between love and hate. And I think understanding more about that is interesting both biologically, but also, of course, when we think about how can we better intervene in things that we recognize now as, or might have historically been called crimes of passion or these kind of things. How might we be able to help people who are feeling that transition from love to hate and might do an act of violence, for example? How can we intervene earlier and make the world a safer place, essentially? And that, of course, is an interesting concept. And actually, most of us kind of know this from classical literature and perhaps from our own experiences, this idea of having a strong relationship with someone that has turned over. This is an image from literature of one of the earliest classical references to this idea of love turning to hate. This is Pausanias, the lover of Philip II of Macedon, so the father of Alexander the Great, stabbing him to death after he's been jilted in the back of the theatre, in fact. And there are loads of examples. If you're a fan of Shakespeare, there's loads of love turns to hate sagas. And unfortunately, of course, we come across many of those in real life. And so I think understanding that blend between love and hate in the brain is a really interesting and challenging area to work on. Okay, so there's a bit of the brain that lights up when we hate. What triggers that activity in the first place? So what makes us hate? And you might be sitting there thinking, oh, that's obvious, isn't it? This really makes me hate something. But actually, it's not that obvious. So what you say, I really hate that, is not necessarily the same for the person next to you, right? And by definition, many of us hate things in other people that the people themselves like in themselves. And so the trigger for hatred can be quite complicated. But perhaps the most widespread and reliable way to trigger hatred, unfortunately, is this idea of group identity, and particularly the idea that psychologists refer to as in-group versus out-group behavior. And we, as a species, are disappointingly good at doing in-group and out-group behaviors. And if you think about it, I'm sure all of you in this room, if I asked you, would have that sense of identity. You hopefully don't use it to hate people, but you grow this sense of in-group identity very rapidly. So for example, many of us spend our weekends at sports matches, for example, doing things like this. You put on a scarf or a uniform or whatever. You join a group. I'm an Everton supporter. I'm a whatever it is. And you form a sense of identity with the group you're in. That sense of identity bonds you to people who are in the same group, but automatically distances you from people who are not part of that group. Hence, things like football rivalries and these kind of things. And that sense of in-group identity, and therefore a resistance to people from outside your group, is incredibly deeply ingrained in humanity. And it underpins, unfortunately, many of the most kind of egregious examples of mass hatred from history. So why do we have this incredibly strong sense of in-group identity? Well, it probably is because over evolutionary time, this has been incredibly important and incredibly beneficial. So for most of our history as a species, we have lived like this, right? In small groups, initially hunter-gatherer groups, later on forming agricultural groups. But the group identity was absolutely linked to your chance of survival. So you were in a small group that was primarily family-related, but not always. So we know from genetic data that there was some flux between groups. But nonetheless, the group as a whole worked as a team, if you like, and we know very clearly that individual humans are pretty poor at surviving on their own in the wilderness. Groups of humans are really good because of our ability to communicate and to do things together. To make that work, you have to have strong group coherence, right? If you're hunting and gathering, somebody needs to go hunting, somebody needs to gather, somebody needs to be looking after the babies, whatever it is. You need a team identity. So for most of human history, your in-group was your survival factor. Conversely, your out-group was the biggest risk you faced. At best, a new group arriving was a major competition, right? They were hunting the same things and gathering the same things and so on and so forth. That's the minimum. At worst, they were a major threat. They might come and steal your partners, kill your babies, do whatever. And so over most of evolutionary time, we have been selected to favor in-groups and select strongly against out-groups. And this idea that you strike first before they can strike you. And it is that ingrained evolutionary process, I think, that drives a lot of the problems we have today with hatred, because we are programmed to look for similarity and difference in each other. We are looking, even perhaps now in this room, we are looking at things we have in common with people and things we have different. That might be we're all members of the same family, or we're all members of the same country, or it might be we all go to the same club, we went to the same school, doesn't matter. But probably as you're listening to this, you're kind of thinking already of the warm feeling you get, right? If you meet someone on the bus and you're making conversation and they say, yeah, I went to that school too. And immediately you have this, they're probably quite nice. Not necessarily, right? They might be awful. But you have this predisposition to say, they went to my school, I bet they're decent human beings. In contrast, you're sat next to this person you think you know really well, and you say, I don't know, I'm a huge, Arsenal fan. And they're like, I hate Arsenal. And you think, that's a shame. I quite liked you until then. You've got this immediate difference because you've declared your ownership or your belonging to a different group. So we are pre-programmed to look for similarities and differences. And of course, the easiest way over sort of biological evolutionary time is to look for a very visible signal of, are you with me or against me? And one easy, very obvious signal of that is skin color. So if you think about skin color, my clicker has died, so I can't actually advance to show you the next slide. It's updating. I'm hoping someone magically behind the scenes will resolve that for me. Well, I'll keep talking in the meantime whilst our magical backroom people stop it updating, hopefully. So one of the key things that we have to think about if you're thinking about visible differences is that idea of similarity. So if you're thinking about what is the easiest way? How do I know whether you're in my group or out of my group? You can look at somebody quite obviously, and then a straightforward thing is, if they have a different skin color, then you know, to a first approximation, they're not immediately closely related to you, right? There are all sorts of caveats there, but in principle, different skin color, you're a different group. You clearly don't know that someone with the same skin color is the same group as you, but it's a very easy, very superficial way to say that person's a different group. Same thing for all sorts of other signs and signals. Gender is another one, right? I'm a man, you're a woman, or we're immediately different. You might be closely related, but you are part of a different group. You have a different set of drivers. That process of visible signals, biologically, is a kind of first proxy. Clearly, it's a pretty rubbish one for all sorts of reasons. And so what's happened over time is that we as humans with culture have started to put on additional levels of signal. So in this particular image, for example, you can see another one that we do all the time. We often put on uniforms. Okay? We are putting on a uniform to declare our membership of a group and our difference to another group. This person is a member of a group, a particular army, a particular country. If you're wearing that uniform, you're in my group. If you're wearing a different uniform, you are definitely not in that group, okay? And so we do that. We put on, that might be an army uniform like this one, or a school uniform. It might be a badge, a football scarf, a special hat, doesn't matter. We are displaying a signal of our group identity. And that becomes very interesting when we think about how we respond differently to groups. And one of the things that's most interesting is this idea of individual homogeneity or heterogeneity. And what turns out to be true for all groups, regardless of what group it is that if you are in a group, you believe quite strongly that your group is very diverse. In contrast, you believe that all other groups are much more homogeneous. So you will hear people say this. I suspect we might have heard this example. So for example, if you ask a classical white racist, what do you think of someone who is black? They'll say, they're all the same. By straight determination, that is clearly completely untrue. But there is a sense of, oh, these people who are different to me are all the same. You ask the same white racist, what about white racists? And they'll say, oh, we're really different. All sorts of people hold these views from all sorts of different backgrounds, which again is clearly not true. But there is a sense of, I am representative of the full diversity of humanity. That group over there that I hate is all the same and they're somehow different. And if you look, it doesn't matter what kind of discrimination you're looking for, that is a repeated theme. People say, all whatever, insert your group you like, all people of this race, of this religion, all vegetarians are the same, all meat eaters, we're really diverse. And that is a kind of repeated theme that you see. Therein lies, I think, both a problem and an opportunity. There is an opportunity here, we'll talk about in a minute, that if you can overcome that and start to make people realize that is not always true, you can start to break down some of these hatred barriers. And so events in which people demonstrate the great diversity of groups that apparently are different to yourself is a good way of breaking down some of these ideas of hatred. I think, for example, things like if you look at gay pride festivals where people are deliberately celebrating the diversity of a group that over most of history has been vilified as all the same and all a bit odd. That is a good way to demonstrate to people and to break down some of these early barriers around hatred. So hatred is very often rooted in this idea of in-group versus out-group identity. Interestingly, and slightly disappointingly, it's not just us that do this. It's really quite hard to ask another animal, a non-human animal, whether it hates. And so we don't really know for sure that hatred is not a completely human-specific emotion. But there's pretty good evidence that at least one other species has an emotion very similar to hatred. And that other species is our closest relative, the chimpanzee. So chimpanzees, as you know, have many behaviors that are very similar to humans. They do all sorts of things that look awfully like us. And unfortunately, they also do things that are the kind of worst parts of human behavior, including apparently hatred. And this is largely the result of documentation from Jane Goodall and her team. And Jane Goodall, as you all know, pioneering primatologist who did extensive studies of chimpanzees in the wild. And back in the 1970s, she documented this series of events over about 4 years, actually, 74 to 78, which have become known as the Chimp Wars, in which she witnessed firsthand, and her team witnessed firsthand, essentially an act of genocide by one group of chimps against another. So there were two rival sets of chimps in this particular forest area, and over the course of about 4 years, one troop apparently deliberately hunted and killed and ultimately exterminated chimps belonging to the other group. And actually one of the most disturbing things about this whole episode is if you look at the footage and the documentation, there are acts that we would say, if they were humans, acts of appalling barbarism, things like chimps celebrating over the dead bodies of the chimps they've just killed, carrying corpses around, dismembering them deliberately, and doing many of the things that we associate with horrendous human hatred-driven conflicts today. And so very depressingly, unfortunately, it looks like hatred has been around at least for as long as humans as a species have, and chimps themselves have existed, so several million years. We don't know, of course, whether this also holds true for species that we share a much older evolutionary ancestry for. It's quite difficult to ask a cat or a dog, for example, whether it hates another cat or a dog. But at least for our kind of closest relatives, this does seem to be a conserved emotion. So as you might expect, then, if this idea of hatred has been around for at least as long as we have been around as a species, and as we know, it's an incredibly powerful emotion, you might expect that this in-group behavior that drives a lot of hatred is itself quite strong, and you would be right. It is both a very strong emotion and one that is depressingly easy to precipitate. So let me give you an example of that. Here you have specimen A. Aren't they cute? Butter would not melt in their mouths. This is a group of 6-year-olds. It's not this particular group, but 6-year-olds. And there was a very interesting study in which 6-year-olds in a school were invited to participate. And what happened? They came into school, and when they came into school, they were given either a yellow or a blue jacket to wear. And they would say, you're in the yellow team, and you're in the blue team. That was it. There was no instruction about what you had to do in that team other than your yellows and your blues. And then they were given that all-powerful prize that we know is driving most human behavior, the sweetie. And they were given Skittles, these kind of sweets, and they were told you can either give Skittles to other children or you can punish them for stuff you don't like by taking Skittles away. And literally within minutes, what you started to see was that children given a yellow jacket would reward other yellow-jacketed children and steal Skittles from blue-jacketed children, and vice versa. 10 minutes previously, they didn't belong to that group, but by giving them a group identity, you have precipitated this idea of in-group versus out-group difference. And in this case, it's just a bit of Skittle exchange. Although, I don't know, stealing a Skittle from a 6-year-old, that's a pretty big crime. But you can see quite easily, unfortunately, how you can drive very, very dangerous behaviors simply by telling people they belong to a group. And that, of course, is the root of many things we do as a society. And in some cases, you have to do that. It's really important. So if you think about creating an army, for example, you need to make a really strong sense of in-group identity between very diverse people in your army. We take people from all over the country, for example, to join our army. They have nothing in common often, other than their interest in joining the army, but they have to form a strong in-group identity. And so there are very easy ways to do that, like, for example, giving them a uniform. This is obviously a picture from a long time ago. If you're in a red coat, you're with me. If you're not in a red coat, you're not. If you're carrying a particular shield, you're with me. If you're not carrying a shield, you're not, so on and so forth. And that enforces this strong in-group identity. It's a powerful emotion when you're fighting a war. Unfortunately, it's difficult to turn it off. And so it's not a surprise in some senses that you might create a very strong in-group identity that helps you fight a war. But unfortunately, when you've started to win, you can't just switch it off. And if not for no reason, do we therefore see often atrocities and crimes on the back of conflict, because you have driven such a strong sense of in-group behavior that when you are dealing with, for instance, prisoners of war, you still see them as an out-group that is of less value than your in-group and therefore reasonable to subject to acts of violence or other things. And so that idea of in-group and out-group behavior very, very strongly linked to this kind of identity that you give people. So that's all a bit depressing. It's a really powerful emotion. It's quite easy to make, very difficult to turn off, and leads to violence. There's not much good news in here. So is there anything we can do to make things a bit brighter? Can we potentially tackle hatred and use our understanding of the biology of hatred to rectify things? And happily there are, although none of them are easy. So the easiest way, or the most obvious way, if you like, to tackle hatred is with its opposite, which is compassion. So hatred relies on this idea that the thing you're hating is different to you. Compassion is the opposite. Compassion is understanding that we all have some similarities. So, for example, if you see someone who's homeless, you might think to yourself, I'm never going to be homeless. I've got nothing to do with that person. If you can envisage yourself as being homeless, then actually you start to have compassion. And it's quite difficult to hate someone or some group which has some similarity with you. This idea of empathy, of being able to put yourself into someone's shoes, is a really important way of combating hatred. And the easiest way to do that is to try and break down this sense of otherness that comes with in-group versus out-group behavior. So activities in which people from apparently distinct groups do things together are incredibly powerful ways to combat hatred. So, for example, if you bring different religious communities or different ethnic communities or different members of different groups together, and you start to see things like, I always thought, I am religion A, and I always thought that people of religion B ate something different. And then you find yourself in the same queue, at the same canteen, eating the same sandwich. And it starts to push home this message that actually your in-group identity and your out-group otherness are not completely set in stone. And so there's very good data that the more you can bring groups together, and whether that's community groups or religious groups or whatever, the more difficult you make it for people to stick to their in-group ideology and therefore to stick to their process of hatred. Hence, the success of programs in which, for example, you have reconciliation between different groups, or you bring people with racist ideology together with people that they were previously racist about, and try and highlight the similarities we have. Those things are clearly quite difficult to do. There are, however, I think things that are simpler to do, where we think about the indirect signals that are associated with group identity. And we have a sort of live example in the UK here from very recent times, when we have things like the flag campaign. Ostensibly, that is a positive signal about enhancing group identity, right? Let's all be proud about our UK-ness. The problem is, anything that enhances in-group identity, by definition, enhances out-group otherness. So if you are encouraging people to say, we are all members of the same country, and isn't that wonderful, you are by implication, even if you don't want to, by implication, you are saying other countries are different. They are out-groups. And so these signals that may be there for very, very positive reasons actually inevitably lead to the risk of emphasizing otherness and risk. And so perhaps instead of signals that say, here is a group and it's different to other groups, we should be thinking about celebrating groups as a whole. So signals where you say, there is a group here, there's a different group, but it's exactly equivalent over here, are very powerful ways of highlighting both group identity, but also the similarities we share between groups. And so there's a strong incentive, I think, to think about how we maintain both that individuality, but also that sense of purpose together with other groups. So that's one strategy, but people, by definition, will continue to hate and will continue to act upon it. We have done that for probably millions of years and will continue to do so. So we still need a strategy to tackle hatred on an individual basis. And in particular, in our modern social media-driven world, one of the most frequent sources of problems for hatred is social media and all the stuff that's associated with it. That has led to this discussion of a response to that, which is the idea of counter-speech, the idea of not letting stuff go when people say stuff that is inappropriate, that is hate-driven, but tackling it with speech back. That seems like a pretty sensible way to go forwards and is really important when you consider the massive wave. So this is data from Facebook, plenty of other social media platforms exist, looking at the number of hate-driven posts that they have removed per quarter. And what you can see here, I mean, this graph goes up and down, obviously. The going down is largely a response to much more stringent activity against it, rather than the world suddenly becoming a much more benevolent place, unfortunately. But what you see is even now, when we've taken a really strong length to try and clamp down on this, Facebook is still taking down about 1 million posts a month for hate speech. That's an awful lot of hate out there in the ether. So how can we combat that? And there's been some very interesting work looking at what is the most effective way to combat hatred in social media. And so this study from a couple of years ago looked at 3 different approaches to tackle hatred. Okay? So one thing you can do is you can try and trigger that sense of empathy in the person doing the hating. So in the blue box over here, we're saying, this is hurtful. You're upsetting people, and you're trying to trigger this idea that, oh, I didn't really mean to do that. You're trying to stimulate empathy in the person who's posted, in this case, a tweet, but it could be other social media. Or you can do what's in the red box, which I think is, for those of us who are British in the audience, is a terribly British thing to do, isn't it? Well, try and sort of laugh this off in a slightly disapproving way, and it will all be fine. I suspect many of us have found ourselves in a position where, you're in a social circumstance and someone says something that's actually a bit inappropriate. I don't know, oh, I really hate the French. And you try and say something like, oh, you're not going to France on holiday this year then, Kevin? And hope that in somehow making light of it, you will point out to Kevin that he shouldn't have said that in the first place. And that is, that varies by culture, but that is quite a common response, I think. So kind of using a humorous but slightly pithy way to respond is in the red box. Or in the green box, you can remind people that there are consequences to hate speech. So in this case, you can see this too. This is this sort of idea of your mum might see this and tell you off. There are consequences to hate speech. And you can post things like, hate speech is a crime, and the police might come and knock on your door, whatever it is, there is a penalty associated with this. So in this study, what they did was they identified hate speech in Twitter, in this case, and responded randomly with one of these 3 approaches to the individual doing that. And what they found was quite interesting. So the first thing they found, depressing for those of us who tried that terribly, tongue-in-cheek British response, humour is completely ineffective. So the red bar at the bottom, you can make a humorous quip and say, well, you won't be going to France anymore. It has no effect at all. People don't notice, they don't respond, they don't take down their hate tweets, they keep it there. It's rubbish, so don't try that at home. The other two approaches, reminding people there are penalties or trying to get them to empathise with the person they are hating against, are pretty effective. So you can see here that both of those approaches statistically significantly led people to delete the offensive tweet they posted in the first place. So that's a good starter for 10, right? You tell people, that's really naughty, don't do it again, or you're really hurting people, and more often than not, they take the tweet down. The problem is, if you look at what happens next, so if you tell them you're going to get punished, they take the tweet down, but then they do it again. So the green bar here shows they repost or post another hate tweet just as frequently as they would have without in the first place. So although telling them they're going to get penalised makes them take the tweet down, it doesn't change their behaviour. But the interesting bar is the blue bar. If you can make them empathise and take away the post in the first place, they are less likely to post the hate post again later on. You have permanently, or at least in the course of this trial, altered their likelihood of hating again, because you have triggered this idea that actually that out group you're hating, whatever it was, immigrants, people with a different skin colour, people who belong to a different club, you have triggered this idea that they are actually not quite as different as you thought they were, and you've permanently altered that person's likelihood of hating against them. And so I think that is a very encouraging piece of data about how you might start to intervene, particularly in kind of social media, but in other areas too. So my kind of lesson for this evening is if you go home later on public transport and someone says something inappropriate, don't tell them the police are going to come for them. Definitely don't tell them a joke, but do try and remind them they're hurting people, and maybe you'll have a small impact on their kind of hate behaviours going forwards. But don't do it if they look like they're going to punch you in the nose. I don't want any injuries in this. Okay, so hatred is a kind of long programmed thing. It's an evolutionary programmed thing. There are some things we can do against it, but it's tricky. What about biologically? We said at the start of this lecture that there's no single region of the brain that drives hatred, but there is a complicated mesh of things which work together. Can we learn more about the biology of hatred? And perhaps ultimately, could you imagine inventing a drug that could be taken to stop people hating? Wouldn't that be amazing? So for those of you who've been to some of these lectures on other emotions before, this is usually the part of the lecture where I show you a brain image and I say, this is an individual who's had a stroke or had some other thing. They've lost this bit of the brain and ta-da, they no longer have emotion X. The disappointing thing is I'm not going to show you that. I'm going to show you a perfectly normal brain because we have never identified any patient who has a brain lesion or a genetic component or anything else which stops them hating, which is kind of interesting in its own right, although slightly depressing. So there are people out there who are incapable of lots of different emotions because of particularly isolated brain damage. But as far as we know, nobody in the world who is incapable of hatred because they've lost a bit of their brain. Probably because, as we said at the beginning, it's involving lots of different areas of the brain working together. So there's no evidence for a specific genetic basis to hatred or a specific brain region for hatred. But there is some interesting data that suggests that our patterns of hatred may have some level of dependency on our brain connectivity. And actually it comes from a very interesting and completely unrelated area where people were studying individuals suffering from serious depression. And in this particular study, what they're looking at is not individual areas of the brain that light up or don't light up during depression, but the connectivity of different parts of the brain together in that disorder. And so these different coloured areas are different parts of the brain, and you can look to see how the different areas of the brain talk to each other during particular conditions. And you can draw maps of connectivity like this in which the lines join parts of the brain that are talking to each other, if you like. And what you can see in this diagram at the bottom here is that the blue lines are what is happening in those of us who don't have depression's brains most of the time, the parts of the brain that are talking to each other in blue. And in red is the different pattern you see in individuals with major depressive disorders. And what you see immediately is that the lines are not in the same place, right? There are some lines where both blue and red overlap, like the one on the far side over there. So that link is the same in all of us. But there are other areas where the link is either present or absent only in people with depression. So there is different linkages between different parts of the brain. And what turns out to be quite interesting, you don't have to understand the base of this graph, but these two graphs show the linkage patterns between individuals without depression and individuals with depression. And if you recall back to the beginning, what you see is the areas where those patterns are different are the same areas that we saw in that original MRI scan lighting up when people hate people, right at the beginning of the lecture. So insular, for example, is one of the areas that is differently connected in this. And so actually, and this generated quite some big headlines at the time, there was this idea that people with depressive disorders have a dysfunction in what's called the hate circuit in the brain. Unfortunately, there is no evidence that people with depressive disorder actually have differences in how they hate. So they apparently hate people just as much or as little as the rest of us do. So this does not appear to be a difference in their ability to hate or their likelihood of hating. And in fact, very sadly, it seems to be more related to the sense of self-hatred, of self-loathing that often accompanies depression. So it looks like this altered connectivity is driving that sense of self-reflected hatred rather than external hatred, which is sort of doubly depressing. But it does suggest that there is a link between this connectivity in the brain and its ability to generate feelings of hatred that maybe in the fullness of time might help us tackle that. So that might sort of suggest that we're going to struggle to come up with an anti-hate medicine, and I think it's probably true, but there's maybe a little tiny chink of possibility here. And it's a bit of a stretch, but go with me on this. So we clearly don't know from other animals, other than maybe chimps, whether hatred is an emotion that they have. I can't tell if I go home whether my dog really hates that cat or whether it's just kind of trying to chase it. But we do know from a lot of studies that you can trigger very potent aggression, which is not a million miles away from hatred, in other animals through particular chemicals. And so this is best studied in rodents. And so in mice, for example, you might know if you keep mice, that mice are highly territorial and can be extremely aggressive against each other. That aggression can be stimulated by the presence of specific volatile molecules that are released normally in things like male mouse urine. So there's a molecule called SBT, or one with a delightful name of dehydrobrevicommin, which are molecules that are secreted into mouse urine. And if another mouse smells them, it drives very potent aggressive responses, kind of like mouse hating, really. And so this has stimulated for many years this idea that could there be evidence in humans of something similar. And there is a bit of sort of anecdotal evidence, for example, that particular areas where particular scents are can apparently lead to more aggression or less aggression. There's been a lot of studies in things like pub toilets and these kind of things about whether we might be inhaling pheromones from each other that are more likely to make us aggressive. Pretty much no robust science on that to date. But this idea of volatile chemicals perhaps driving hatred and aggression in humans is a persistent one. And there is a little bit of evidence that is partially true, and I particularly love it because it's a study that I think is just incredibly elegant. And it concerns this molecule called hexadecanol. And hexadecanol is something that we secrete, most mammals do, so mice also produce this. And the reason we're interested in this is because in mice, it alters behavior quite dramatically. We produce hexadecanol too, and more importantly, we have a very, very closely conserved receptor for it that doesn't seem to have changed over evolutionary time, suggesting that as well as making the chemical, we still have the means in ourselves to detect it. And so people are interested in this as a possible volatile signal that might influence human behavior because it influences mouse behavior. We produce it in breath, in our skin, in our feces and things, and the one I particularly like is particularly abundant in babies' heads, which I really love. And people have said for many years, or maybe this is something that, I don't know if those of you who've had babies or other people's babies, often people cuddle babies and go, and they kind of inhale their heads, which is a bit of a weird thing to do. But there is an idea that is driving kind of strong behavioral signals from the baby's head. So there's lots of hexadecanol in babies' heads and in lots of other places. And so people have speculated it might be altering human behavior, and indeed it does. And there's a great study done fairly recently, which I really love about this. So in this study, volunteers were taken and volunteers were allocated money, okay? And they could allocate money to each other. So I could give you some money, and I can give you some money, and I can decide how much money to give you and how much to keep myself. And you as the recipient of that money have two options. You can either take your money and say thank you very much, or if you think you've been treated unfairly, and this is the bit I love, you can punish the person who gave you the money, and you can punish them with a blast of unpleasant noise. And you can choose how bad that is. You can turn the volume, if you really think they were completely unfair, you can blast them with a really high volume, and if you think it was a bit unfair but not too bad, you can turn the volume down a bit. So it's a measure of aggression. Clearly, it's not ethical to get people to punch each other, but blasting them with noise is kind of okay. So you can do this study. You can say, allocate money and see how people respond. And then you can do a measure of how aggressive people are in those circumstances. So you can work out just how much kind of a painful noise you subject your opponent to. And it's a quantitative measure of aggression. And here's the fabulous finding they had. So you do this for people in a normal setting, and what it turns out is you get a range of responses. So the bars here show how loud the noise was that people punished their opponent with. And what you see is that on the left-hand side, your left-hand side, is that people are pretty good at punishing what they feel is unfair behavior normally. If you, unbeknown to them, put hexadecanol in the room, so they're breathing this thing in, they're less likely to blast the person with noise. So superficially, this is great. You can waft hexadecanol into a room and everyone just chills out a bit and is less hating. Wouldn't that be fabulous? But there is a slight downside here, which is if you look in more detail at this, the volunteers they had in the study, obviously, were a mixture of men and women, like all good scientists. And this is the pooled data. But now if you split it by gender, look at this. This is not so good, is it? It turns out that men, we're so chilled out, sniff a hexadecanol, we turn the volume right down. Women, oh my goodness, they turn it up big time. And in fact, it's an amazing piece of data. It is almost completely bimodal. So women, given a whiff of hexadecanol, all get much more aggressive. Men get much more chilled out, which sort of leads me to think, on the one hand, it's kind of optimistic. Maybe you can intervene in the future and come up with an anti-hatred medication. On the other hand, it does worry me, the idea that we may have a world in which the men are all chilled out and the women are really, really aggressive all the time, which is quite a scary thought. So perhaps, to finish with, perhaps our best advice is to not hold your hopes out for a medication, but to do something that we know is incredibly good at overwhelming hatred, which is finding the person you hate and giving them a good hug instead. Thank you very much indeed.
Robin, thank you very much indeed. And when we do have sometimes questions, the lights are actually quite bright in my eyes. Thank you very much. We've got a question there at the back. If you can take the microphone from Christine.
One of the examples you gave was the children having a different colour jackets, and multiple children with yellow, multiple blue, and then split up. If you'd only had one child in yellow and one child in blue, do you think you'd have got the same reaction?
Well, I guess the problem with that is you can't test whether they're going to collaborate with... If there's only one, you can't test whether they collaborate more with each other or not. There is a thing about group size. So very loosely, the bigger a group gets, the harder it is to maintain that in-group identity. And I guess anecdotally we think about that. So you often find that, for example, small countries are much more patriotic than big countries, because it's easier to say, I am Belgian, and there are not that many of us, than it is to say I am American, because America is a much bigger country. So there is something about kind of group size and how you can hold that sense of identity. When you really scale it back down, at a certain point, if you're doing, it depends on the kind of activity you're doing. At a certain point, it becomes unsustainable to act as a group if you're so small. So, for example, if you've got three of you, there are 3 yellows and 3 blues, but the task you do is actually kind of requires more than 3. What you see is this initial group activity when people sort of sit together, and then a kind of logical realization that you can't build that bridge or sail the boat or whatever with that, and a kind of overwhelming. And then what's very interesting is then people then impose a new group dynamic. So in that model, what you would find is people say, well, let's rip all the vests up and stick them together to have a yellow and blue vest instead. So we want to be part of a group. And so you often see that, for example, with things like clubs and societies that fuse together. You might know this, just like you have, I know, the South Oxford Tiddlywinks Club and the North Oxford Tiddlywinks Club, and they have different badges, and then someone says, well, this is a bit silly, should we just have one Tiddlywinks Club? And no one wants to give up. So you don't say, I'll have your badge. No. What you do is you create a new badge that has bits of the two things, and you put them together to give that sense of identity fusing rather than the in-group separation, which I think is quite an interesting thing to think about in all sorts, not just tiddlywinks, but in all sorts of contexts.
Got another question over here.
Thank you. Biologically, is there any difference between hate from in-group and out-groups and hate towards individuals?
That's a really good question. So most of the work has been done on in-group and out-group because you can do that in a kind of ethical way. So things like the Skittles example are quite easy. Individual hatred gets quite tricky because the places we often see that are, so the most obvious one is in sort of individual hate crimes, right? Or crimes of passion where someone, they were married for 20 years and then suddenly it goes sour and, people beat each other up. Understandably, it's quite difficult to do studies in that. There is a bit of a challenge also because clearly for most of us, you might have a relationship for a long time, you might split up, you might be sad, but you don't go and beat them up or poison their tea or something. For a small number of people, that does happen. And so there is a distinction, I think, between the kind of precipitating conditions that allow that to happen, i.e. the breakup of your relationship, and the specific behaviours in an individual that might predispose them to be violent. And it's very hard by, for example, MRI imaging to distinguish what is the kind of hate bit versus they were predisposed to violence in the beginning kind of part of the brain. So that's quite difficult to do. So that's a long-winded way of saying there's not an obvious distinction between them. I think the biggest distinction will be between the acute versus chronic. So that sense of, I have grown up hating people who are belonging to that group all my life. So for example, embedded kind of institutional racism, it's part of a culture that someone's grown up with their whole life, as opposed to, you've just jumped the queue in Sainsbury's and I hate you for it, which is a much shorter thing. And that, I think, is quite distinct because hopefully it doesn't, you don't end up hating that person forever just because they jumped the queue once. Although, of course, in some cases you do. I mean, there are, clearly documented cases in which a relatively trivial thing has led to a campaign of hatred for a long period of time. I'm not aware of any studies in those groups, so that would be really interesting. What is it that makes someone turn against their neighbour and be embarking on a 25-year war of hatred, whereas the rest of us just go, well, let's hope they move soon.
We've got one right here at the front.
You mentioned there's a relation with hatred and aggression. Is there also a relation in the brain between hatred and fear?
Hatred and fear, yes, there is. And also fear and aggression. So it's kind of a complicated trio. So there's two parts of that. So fear, so in some cases, the hatred is driven by fear in the sense that so there's for example, there's an out group that represents a genuine threat to you. So you fear them, but you also hate them. So an example might be, if you think about an oppressive regime, and they might have a secret police, for example. You're afraid of the secret police because they might throw you into prison or execute you or something. But you also hate them because they are imposing themselves on your life in that way. So the two things are linked. What's quite interesting is that there's not an obvious correlation between those two things. So people can be fearful of stuff that they don't hate. So for example, you might have a phobia of spiders. You're definitely afraid of them. Some people will say, I hate spiders, I want to kill all spiders, I'm afraid of them. But there are quite a lot of people out there who say, I'm really scared of spiders, but I don't wish them ill, I just don't want them in my bed. And so there is a distinction, I think, between fearing something, which is quite common, and hating that fear. And it's not for all fears, and it's relatively poorly worked out, I think, so far. And of course, the other way around is not necessarily true. So people hate some things that you don't necessarily fear. So people who are massively misogynistic might say, I really hate women. It's not because they're afraid of, getting stuck. Maybe it is because they're getting afraid. But most of the time, it's not because they're afraid of women. They have some other deep-seated hatred that is not related to that fear.
I'm going to take one online, which may be difficult to answer precisely, but someone's asked, could my son's neurological condition, which causes him to lash out and then apologise, be related to similarities in brain activity between love and hatred?
That's an interesting question. So, without knowing the details, I couldn't really comment on the specific case, but so generally, those kind of sporadic outpourings of anger, if you like, are more about, it's more about anger than it is about hatred, happily. So if you think about, and that can be true of neurological conditions in which people lash out like that. It can also just be true of normal life. So, for example, lots and lots of examples of people having too much to drink and then beating up their best mate and then being massively apologetic afterwards. They don't hate their best mate, but the barrier to aggression has been lowered and the trigger has come in. So I think probably not is the short answer, happily. And I think there is, it's really important to make that distinction, I think, between that kind of short-term, either deliberate or inadvertent, in this case, kind of aggression, versus the long-term, deep-seated hatred. And of course, not always, hatred doesn't always come with aggression. There are lots of people out there who sit and quietly hate, but don't actually ever act on it, thank goodness. But they are fomenting that hatred, if you like.
Should we pop back in the room again? There's one right at the back over there.
Is it feasible that one day we might have a hexadecanol pill that we can take before we go to the pub, or we bring out babies that we sniff? Do you see that as where that research may end up?
I think that's interesting. Yeah, the therapeutic baby sniff before you go into a football match would be interesting, wouldn't it? I think so. So I think. I mean, so there's two things to that. I think potentially, I think it's entirely plausible that we may come up with biological signals, whether that's hexadecanol or other molecules, or there's quite a bit of interesting things like microbiome products that your bacteria in your intestine might make that modulate mood, and you could definitely plausibly think of a mechanism by which you might be able to reduce people's likelihood of hatred. So the idea that you might, for example, be exposed to molecules in a situation where you might have a significant aggression, like a football match. You could imagine that maybe we could create conditions in which you slightly reduce that. I really don't think that will stop hatred. It won't suddenly be a miraculous thing, but you might kind of tone it down slightly. It raises a very interesting question, of course, which is, at what point is that ethical and not ethical? I think most of us would say, if you could intervene and stop violent crime associated with racism, that's a pretty good thing to do. What about, I hate my ex-husband. Should we be, you're not actually ever going to kill him in his sleep. Are we intervening, or is it your kind of human right to feel hatred? And at what point do you sort of intervene in that? So I think, fortunately, we're a long way off that, and I suspect we may never get there. But I do think it's feasible that you might be able to adjust things. I think much more interesting, probably, or much more powerful, is not a chemical approach, but a kind of psychological intervention approach. And things like, helping communities to work together, individuals who've been convicted of hate crimes, having psychotherapy to try and explore that and understand and empathise with their victims, are pretty effective if you can get engagement. So I think that's probably where the best fruit lies, if you like, in treating this.
Right at the front over here.
Sorry, just keep your steps in, Christine.
So obviously there's a genetic element to the ability to hate or empathise. I was just wondering whether in different groups, and groups could be identified as a country or a religion, or other groups like you've illustrated, whether some groups are more genetically prone to different levels of hatred or different ability to empathise.
So that's quite interesting. So I think there's no robust data suggesting there's a kind of genetic predisposition to hate more or to hate less. Which is kind of interesting because there are genetic kind of patterns for lots of other emotions. So I think the short answer is very unlikely that there's a kind of genetic or a sort of societal, if you like, kind of pre-programming. So you can't say this group hates much more than this group here. What is very clear, though, is that the culture you're brought up in is incredibly, incredibly important. So, and that's at all levels. So a society that, for example, says, we are, the state religion is X, other religions are bad, invokes a lot more hatred, actually not just for the other religion, but it kind of predisposes that as an acceptable thing to do. So you often see that it's associated with, you might hate all people who have that other religion, but you also hate all these people over here who've got nothing to do with religion, but because you're pre-programmed for that. And it very much happens at the level of individuals. There's very clear data that growing up in a household in which things like racist ideology or strong religious discrimination are commonplace, very, very strongly influences you as a child, and it's quite difficult to shake that growing up, actually. So that early intervention in kind of setting a societal norm is very influential, much more so than any kind of genetic basis, I think.
And I'll take one final one from the room just at the front here. Lady just here.
Just wondering, in view of the experiment with the blazers, Do you think school uniforms are a good idea?
Oh, now I'm in dangerous territory, aren't I? So I think the data on school uniforms is actually quite interesting. So it is absolutely true that things that reinforce in-group identity, by definition, enforce out-group identity and kind of risk that process. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, there's also quite strong evidence that in-group identity helps, in particular with things like discipline, but also things like attainment. So this idea that if you're in an in-group, you are responsible for the outcomes of the group. So, for example, if you think about schools, if you're in an in-group, and it might be within a school, I'm in a house, or I'm in a, you're in the, whatever, Badgers. Oh dear, Badgers attendance is pretty poor this term, kids. And it does work. People are like, oh, I'm a Badger, I better try really hard to go to school tomorrow. So it has quite a big benefit, particularly in terms of relatively regimented environments like schools, armies, hospitals, those kind of places where people basically need to conform. But you're absolutely right that there is a real danger that they also, can flip over. And I think, armies are a great example, right? A well-orchestrated, disciplined army is a very effective fighting force. Unfortunately, you've got to rein that in pretty fast when your conflict is over. Otherwise, it causes massive damage. So, yes, a real challenge. So on uniforms, it's a tricky one, and I'm very pleased I don't have to make that decision at the Department of Education.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm terribly sorry, but I'm afraid we are out of time for the evening. But before I go home to hug a Swindon Town supporter and sniff a baby's head, I have one final duty, which is to ask you to join me in thanking the 39th Professor of Physics, Professor Robin Moe. Thank you very much.